What is up, everyone? Rachel here, aka, ooh, that's a foamy boy, aka Brews with Beerkowski. And I am here to talk to you today about some beer history. So I am what you would call an uber nerd, meaning I have a graduate degree in history and I am a certified cicerone. So let's get nerdy. So I just poured myself a hazy IPA. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the history of the IPA. Because I know a lot of you guys are IPA nerds, but do you actually know the real story? We'll find out. All right, so the IPA is a very exciting thing for historians like me to talk about because there is much legend and lore around how this style formed. So we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper to that story today. And I'm probably gonna correct a few things that you think you already know about how the India Pale Ale was developed. The legend of the development of the IPA says that the East India Trading Company, which was owned by the Crown in London, was shipping beer from London to India. And the beer was spoiling on that 6-month journey. So brewers in London had to develop and think of a better way to preserve the beer for that 6-month journey. So what they started doing is they started adding more hops to their beer recipes because hops naturally have an antimicrobial property. And then suddenly, somehow, magically, the beer was able to make the journey. Wrong. All right, let's get into the real story. I think the most important part about this legend that is absolutely incorrect and that you need to get out of your head right now is that beer was not able to make the 6-month journey from London to India. Before the IPA was ever even a spark in somebody's mind, London brewers had been shipping beer to the British colonies in India for at least 100 years or more. And guess what? The beer was getting there just fine. So that was never actually a real problem. But before we start talking a little bit more about the IPA, the India Pale Ale, we have to talk a little bit about the development of pale beers, period. Okay, so before the Industrial Revolution and before the invention of the malt drum, most beers were very, very dark. So think porters and stouts. And this is the kind of beers that people in London were drinking. Actually, the name porter for the style of beer was named after the porters of London, which were the folks that mostly consumed that beer. So that's a fun little beer trivia fact you can take with you. Because these darker beers were the popular beer styles of the time, those are the styles of beers that were being shipped over to the British colonies. Makes perfect sense, right? Beer was super popular and it was always being shipped over to the British colonies. And eventually, outside of the darker beers that the Londoners were very familiar with, people started shipping some paler beers over as the development of malting with the malt drum developed. One of those styles of beers is something that you have probably heard of before, an October Ale. Sometimes also known as an Oktoberfest in our contemporary beer drinking culture. Now, when I say Oktoberfest, I don't want you to get confused with the German style of Oktoberfest beer to the October Ale style that would have been what the English were brewing at the time. So what I want you to think of more when I say October Ale is going to be a paler but very, very strong, highly hopped beer. Almost kind of like a barley wine. Not quite, but almost. So eventually, several different brewers started sending this type of beer over to India. It was new, it was different, and guess what? People really, really liked it. So they started calling this new style of beer Pale Ale exported for India. And then after a while, it was shortened to India Pale Ale. So I think the most important takeaway from this whole story is that the development of the IPA was less about hops and more about the development of malting and brewers using paler malts and experimenting with those malts, and then experimenting with hops and seeing what sort of new, paler, crisper, refreshing beers they could ultimately get. If you have any more questions about the history of the IPA, let me know in the comments below. And of course, as always, if there's something specific that you want to learn about pertaining to beer history, please let me know. I am here for you. I love telling stories and I love getting nerdy.